No, Jeff was very polite in pointing out that most of that happened a century ago, and it's getting old really quick. Anyway, I wanted to thank everybody for attending here tonight. As Jeff said, as a counselor for Annenberg, it's a privilege actually to see some students, because most of the time, candidly, he has me in meetings that involve fundraising. So it is good to see that there's another aspect to the university. But it really is a great pleasure to be here with tonight to discuss a topic that I think is of vital importance to America's standing in the world. I was honored to be asked to talk about the conduct of our public diplomacy and how we can more effectively communicate America's interests around the globe. And what's interesting about it, before I get into actually the formal remarks, is 2 weeks ago I gave a speech in Prague. And while the speech in Prague had a lot to do with issues involving the European Union and, frankly, the free discourse of ideas, what's fascinating is most of the questions had to do with America's conduct and where America is. And again, it was an audience composed of both communications professionals, corporate, but frankly a lot of students who were asking very similar questions to, I suspect, what you're asking today. You know, when I look at USC, it clearly has a very important role to play, not only developing new and innovative solutions to improving America's public diplomacy, perhaps being more important is being engaged on the ground, organizing events and activities that bring people together from around the world. You know, as a renowned publisher, Walter Annenberg was a strong supporter of one of America's most successful public diplomacy initiatives of the last century. It was called the Marshall Plan. And as ambassador to Great Britain later on, he was one of our country's greatest and most outstanding diplomats. So I can't think of a better university to actually take on the task of really taking a look at what America could do to improve its reputation in the world. No doubt Mr. Annenberg today would be very disappointed with the state of public diplomacy. Anti-Americanism is on the rise, not just in the Muslim world, but among many of our long-term allies in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Some of this is perhaps inevitable. Let's face it, we're the world's lone military superpower. And with that distinction comes a natural perception of imperialism. What's disturbing is that the rest of the world increasingly sees this as our most visible characteristic, instead of what made America truly a unique and attractive idea throughout our history. Our freedom, our political pluralism, a religiously tolerant society, a land of great opportunity. When you think about the magnitude of America's image problem today, it's so severe that not even bold U.S. efforts, such as the massive aid we provided in the aftermath of the tsunami, or President Bush's calls for greater diplomacy in the Middle East, have done little to improve our standing in the world. In fact, recent polls show that many Europeans want to pursue day in and day out more independent policies and interests from the United States. In Asia, what we're seeing is a rising China, viewed much more positively by many citizens than the United States. A massive change in opinion. Large and vocal demonstrations recently greeted President Bush at the recent summit of the Americas. In light of that, let me start with a sort of an assertion that can get me in trouble in my business career. The business of America's public diplomacy, I believe, is too important, too vital for our relationship with other nations and people around the globe to leave to the politicians and the bureaucrats in Washington. America today has way too much at stake, and you as students, candidly, I think, have even more. This is more than just our abilities or our country's ability to conduct foreign policy or advance our security and economic interests. In fact, in today's increasingly interconnected and globalized world, America's image directly impacts our business and trade relationships, which in turn have a real impact on our jobs and our standard of living. In fact, it's going to affect the ability of Americans to interact with and cooperate with citizens from around the globe in about 1 million different ways, large and small. Now, it would be very easy to come here tonight and blame the deteriorating state of American public diplomacy on the Bush administration. After all, the world was never more united behind America than it was in the days immediately after September 11th. Citizens from around the world mourned with us, and in the aftermath of that attack, many Americans understood the need for a U.S. response that went beyond military action, one that addressed winning over hearts and minds in the Muslim world and beyond. Yet in the past 3 years, we have seen a deterioration of America's image. Now, as a person who makes his living from building a reputation, I would argue that neither the Clinton nor the Bush administration have had a comprehensive public diplomacy or brand-building strategy in place, nor, in fact, an experienced, capable team to actually implement one. In fact, our reputational crisis actually goes back to years earlier, when in the wake of the end of the Cold War, Washington began to dismantle our public diplomacy infrastructure. In hindsight, we should have done just the opposite. During the Cold War, it was real simple. It was very black and white. We as Americans were the good guys. The Soviets were the bad guys. The rest of the world chose between the two of us. And public diplomacy played the key role in the Cold War. We empowered moderate voices in communist countries to carry our message of political freedom in market economies. We used broadcasting to reach people who did not have free access to media and information in their own countries. And this was an incredibly powerful tool to spread American values and interests. Most importantly, we understood that winning the Cold War meant investing in both hard diplomacy, that is military, as well as soft diplomacy, the spreading of our values, supporting our allies, and providing aid to people in need. Today's international arena has many more shades of gray, more competing centers of world power and influence. You as students are going to discover this as you make your way in the world of communications. We have a communications environment that today is global, instantaneous, and has far more impact on opinion and behavior than ever before. Civil societies around the world today are empowered to act and influence how corporations, governments, and multilateral institutions behave. Now let me say at the outset that I don't have an immediate solution to our public diplomacy crisis, and it is, I believe, a crisis. What I think I can do as someone who runs a global public relations agency and who regularly travels around the world and meets with leaders of government, business, along with people in my own offices and my own network, is to help define some of the issues and then to establish some areas for us to discuss up here as a panel. The reason I don't have a solution is because I don't believe there is a magic bullet. There's no single action or behavior we can take as a nation that's going to instantaneously make the rest of the world like and respect us. Now, some have been proposed. For example, you'll hear it said, if we just stopped supporting Israel, if we just withdrew from Iraq, or if we had just elected John Kerry as president last year, our image around the world would improve. I think that's wishful thinking, and I think it is dangerous thinking. Our foreign policy must represent our core values as a nation, not be designed to enhance our popularity or simply be a tool to polish our image. That said, I do believe finding a solution requires us to accurately understand the problem we face. We need to stop thinking about public diplomacy as a short-term political campaign. This means being prepared for the inevitable, that we can't fix the issue today, and we're not going to fix it for that matter tomorrow. Now, it's very difficult for governments to think this way, because governments understand the short-term political campaign. Administrations know how to run them, and successful ones know how to win them. Every administration, Democrat or Republican, looks for quick victories and immediate success. Pass the law, host a summit, conduct a poll, declare victory, and move on to the next issue or crisis. However, public diplomacy and the challenge it faces for the United States is much different. First, we have to accept it's a long-term effort, and if we do, then we're not going to treat it as a tactical campaign, organizing a listening tour here, a television broadcast there, and a few educational and cultural exchanges and media interviews in between. We can step back and think seriously about strategic goals and needs, and what resources, infrastructure, and ideas are needed to implement them. We're not going to change people's views overnight. It's going to take a generation, as it did, frankly, with communism. And by resources, I mean more than just throwing additional money at public diplomacy, though we spend far too little on it, and we're going to have to decide to commit more public and private funding in the future. Every day, the Pentagon alone outspends the State Department's annual budget for public diplomacy. Every day, 1 day of the Pentagon spending outspends all the money the United States puts into public diplomacy. And we clearly need to involve more people, especially from outside of government and from more walks of life. The State Department is set up to manage government-to-government relationships. It has the infrastructure to do it through embassies around the world. It has the career Foreign Service trained to work and interact with its counterparts in other countries, with elites in other societies. Unfortunately, in today's world, this is not enough. For effective diplomacy, we have to reach out to opinion makers and trendsetters in these nations, the bloggers, people on the street, through the media, internet, business, and entertainment worlds. Now, if we start with just thinking about it because we're here in Los Angeles, let's start with America's entertainment industry. Our culture is one of our largest exports. American movies, television, music permeate every corner of the globe. It's both admired and reviled. It is a powerful force, and we need our most creative minds to be part of educating foreign audiences about America, our values, and our relationships with other countries and peoples. It's important that Hollywood be concerned with its role In fact, I would argue is the most visible messenger of who we are as a people in society. It has a very special responsibility. This also means that it has to be sensitive to how our films stereotype us and our attitudes. When our television, music, and motion picture industries foster stereotypical images of us and other cultures, faiths, and societies, it defines who we are. Now, I recognize that entertainment is a business, and like all businesses, is driven by markets and profits. And I'm not advocating censoring in any form, nor even so-called political correctness. What I am saying is that Hollywood needs to be more sensitive to the impact its cultural products have on others, as well as how they portray Americans to other societies. And we must harness the power of Hollywood to get our message across. It is an important program. They can do an immense amount of good. We have to, however, be able to figure out how to harness that power. Second, U.S. multinational companies need to be much more involved in public diplomacy. Many today are increasingly concerned about how people around the world feel about the United States and how this is going to impact the value of their global brands. Some try to demonstrate they're a local company by minimizing their Americanism. I don't think that's going to be an effective strategy in the long run. It's one that people will always see through. Consumers recognize that while the local facility may be locally managed and employ local workers, the products that they're selling are generally uniquely American. In fact, that's part of the image that most of these corporations are actually trying to sell. Now, I do think American companies are a great asset to advance our public diplomacy around the world. They can have a positive and do have a positive impact on local economies, creating jobs, fostering trade. Many manage corporate social responsibility and philanthropic programs where they operate. These programs improve local living standards and community needs. They reflect our values as a nation. U.S. multinationals also have large networks of offices and employees around the globe, in many cases larger than the U.S. government. More and more companies are seeing the value of developing global corporate social responsibilities that ensure a consistency of messages, values, behavior, and philanthropic activities across global markets where they operate. In fact, many students like yourselves, usually when they apply for jobs in our field, ask first and foremost to work in those type of arenas. If you look at the example of Bill Gates, his tremendous commitment to addressing global care and education sends an incredibly strong message about America to the world. His example shows the power of what an American CEO can do and the impact they can have on our country and our country's image. What's needed is for Washington to set up the proper institutional infrastructure to enable multinational corporations to do better, to channel their resources, ideas, and talents into public diplomacy. And this needs to be done in a way that provides an independent vehicle for them to do so, but at the same time supports America's broad foreign policy objectives. One way of doing this would be something that Dean Cowan is very familiar with, to create a corporation for public diplomacy, similar to what we did in the Cold War, through which multinational companies, private foundations, and even NGOs could participate. It could do so much. It could support a wide variety of public diplomacy projects and outreach efforts around the world that meet a pre-established set of criteria and goals. Of course, the advantage of such a corporation is that it could operate with some independence of the U.S. government, and therefore might attract considerable talent, funding, and ideas that would be difficult to be undertaken through a solely government entity. It could leverage private sector creativity and flexibility, and it would exist beyond one administration and have a long-term goal and charter to enhance America's reputation by making sure other people from around the globe are exposed to our values. We can also make sure that multinational companies communicate with their employees, both those of us who are here in America and those of us who are foreign. American companies employ millions of citizens around the globe, and in most developing countries, they're among the largest employers in the economy. To be sure, many American multinational companies are doing great work around the world in the communities where they operate. They're investing billions of dollars and thousands of employees' hours in outreach. But what they need is a forum to share their best practices with each other so they can learn from each other's experience about what works and what doesn't. And the federal government can establish a mechanism by which they can do that. Another area that we can look at is the role of journalism students and journalism schools. As a journalism school yourself, it's important to review the role of media. Americans need to better understand and be informed about the world around us. But the media also has to be aware about how it is used by third parties against us. Clearly, it is a delicate balance. A free and uncensored press is our most important institution. Its value immeasurable. However, that press needs to be sensitive to stories that impugn U.S. government motives and values, and where such stories must be written, and let me be clear, they must be written, They need a higher standard of editorial scrutiny than sometimes we have seen. This scrutiny, however, should be by the press and only by the press. It's something the First Amendment guarantees. It's something we have to honor. But clearly the American media has to understand how stories are being used around the globe. At the same time, television and newspapers need to explain the world better to their viewers and readers. Americans need to meet the world halfway. We need to better understand other people's needs and values, just as we want them to understand and know and accept ours. One journalist who I had the honor of knowing who understood this was the late Peter Jennings. If one of his correspondents told him he would have trouble getting Americans to understand why some event in Bosnia or Rwanda was important, Peter would say, "It's your job to make them understand." And because he realized how important it was for Americans to better understand the world, he was dedicated to traveling and reporting from all corners of the globe. Finally, there's an important role for American educational institutions to play in public diplomacy. Other U.S. institutions should follow the leadership of USC, establish programs like this. They provide opportunities for dialogue and ideas to surface, for events and exchanges to take place. Now, higher education has always been a part of America's public diplomacy. For decades, our universities have attracted students from around the world, many of whom returned to their home countries and became leaders in every field of human endeavor. They take back with them not just a world-class education, but an appreciation of our values and positive personal experiences. This has been, I believe, one of our most effective tools of people-to-people diplomacy. Unfortunately, today, obtaining student visas has become a difficult, costly, and complicated process, as new security restrictions have been imposed. The word has gone out in many countries that America doesn't want foreign students anymore. As a result, international student enrollment in U.S. universities declined in the 2003-2004 academic year. It was the first decline in more than 30 years. Of the more than 25 universities that host the largest number of foreign graduate students, 15 reported enrollment declines, some as large as 15%. This is a trend that has to be reversed. We have to keep the higher education system, the finest in the world, open to the rest of the world. And universities must be able to aggressively attract the best and brightest students in their campus. Just last week, the president of Liberia, the first African woman president, pointed to her Harvard experience as part of her resume. That's public diplomacy for America at its best. Nothing builds our brand better than a statement like that. Now, in addition to doing this at the university level, we also have to start much younger, because it's the children who we're losing, unfortunately, around the world. My company's example is working with the U.S. State Department today in implementing a public diplomacy program to start a dialogue with elementary and high school students in 13 Muslim countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We're helping U.S. embassy officials visit students and spend a few hours talking about America, our values, and what goals both our countries share. In many cases, these visits are the first opportunity for children to talk directly with someone from the United States. And frankly, for the U.S. Embassy personnel, in many cases, it's the first opportunity that some of them have used to get outside of the fortress walls of the embassies and to go into local communities and talk directly with young citizens about America. Finally, and it's very important that we understand this, we can't think of public diplomacy solely because of its impact on the Muslim world. Our long-term strategy has to be global in scope. While there has certainly been a renewed interest in enhancing our public diplomacy capabilities since 2001, with an emphasis on Muslim countries and population, the fact is we can't ignore the rest of the world. We're losing in Europe, we're losing in Asia, and we're losing in Latin America. And when you think about Latin America, it is particularly disappointing that our image is so negative. There are over 30 million Spanish-speaking people in the United States. And there exists a generation of migration that provides cultural and economic links between families and communities throughout the hemisphere. There's simply no excuse for the vacuum that exists today. It shows the depth of our problem. This brings me back to my central point. We need to see public diplomacy as a long-term initiative, one that has as its goal building relationships with other peoples and societies, not simply a short-term campaign to boost America's popularity and image around the world. And to succeed, we're going to need to use every available resource to win. Nothing else is going to do the trick. We have to understand that the goal is to win, and it's to win the hearts and minds of others. The federal government's job is to lead, to provide overall direction and resources, as well as to reach out and bring in others who have a contribution to make. But Washington can't do it alone. More and more Americans need to become involved. Students need to become involved. American business, Hollywood, the media, and our academic community all have a role there. And I hope in our discussion we'll discuss some of those issues and some of those ways by which we can go forward. So thank you.
Nick Cull is our first professor of public diplomacy here at the school, who is an expert on public diplomacy. Just came to us from the University of Leicester, where he has written the history of public diplomacy in England, and has just completed the definitive history of the United States Information Agency. So he's really the person who knows the history of public diplomacy better than virtually anybody. And Nick, it's great to have you with us as well. And I'm hoping that Geoff Garrett's going to be here, but maybe not. I don't know. We thought we had one other person on the panel. Harris, maybe I could start with a question. I thought your remarks were terrific, and I think we as a school have been absolutely in the same wavelength. I'd like to ask you to talk about a couple of bests and worsts from your standpoint. You talk about Hollywood and you talk about corporate America, and I wonder if I could ask you to describe a company that's maybe done a wonderful job in corporate America that others might emulate.
Well, I mean, I think the easy answer is obviously Google, because no matter where I go around the world, people, when they find out that we have some relationship to the internet, want to know. I mean, this is obviously coming off my Prague visit last week or 2 weeks ago. You know, how do you get involved with Google? They think of Google as an international company rather than necessarily as a U.S. company. And I think Google has managed to transcend the issues of being perceived as a local, it's being perceived as a global citizen. The problem with that on the other side of the coin is it's not being perceived as uniquely American. And I would argue that it is actually uniquely American, that Google has the entrepreneurial formula that so often works in this country, that Google attracts people from all over the globe to work for it, that it is truly multi-ethnic in every way. In fact, today's Wall Street Journal had a big story about their dining room. For those of you who read it, I see a lot of nodding heads among the students. I, too, was jealous of that, Kumpai chicken that they talked about. But, this is a company that I think in many respects is doing it right. It's sending a message that it's all-inclusive. And that's what a lot of people are looking for. Companies that do it wrong, I mean, those are harder to single out because they're generally the companies that are perceived to be American icons. But if you go around the globe, even those, I would argue McDonald's, and taking the risk to some of my compatriots who represent them here, McDonald's is doing a terrific job around the globe. I mean, McDonald's is a company that, at the end of the day, has managed to make a product that no matter where you are in the world, people want to go to. But McDonald's is not necessarily being tarred as a solely American company anymore. But at times, when you see, sort of the ugly specter of nationalism rise, it's an easy target. So I would say that it's not because of what they are, it's because to a certain extent of who people perceive them to be. They perceive as American.
Let me ask you about it and then have Nick get into it. And we're going to then open this up for the audience in a few minutes too. In which there are a lot of people who are quite expert, and as you say, a lot of students who are fascinated in this subject. Hollywood. Any products of popular entertainment that come to mind which you think are the sort of things you'd like to see happen, and any that seem to you to be perpetuating the kind of stereotypes that you think are damaging?
Well, it's dangerous in this state, but clearly your governor symbolizes to many people the best of Hollywood, which is that a man who speaks with the accent he speaks with as an immigrant can become a successful businessman, a successful actor, a successful governor in their minds because he got elected. And so, it's fascinating to me is when I'm in Germany and Austria, they can't stop talking about the Terminator. And they perceive that as one of our cultural contributions to the world, which is his movies, and that's the negative that you get. So I would say Hollywood's a mixed bag. I think the problem that Hollywood has is that it's always easy to point at a movie that people believe insults their religious attitudes, their cultural attitudes, while very rarely do people talk about movies that they think contribute to an understanding of this country. I mean, Hollywood's a problem for us.
Nick, nobody has a better understanding of the scope and history of American public diplomacy, and what Harris is doing is sort of seeing it going forward in the next 10, 20, 30 years. As you look back over the history of public diplomacy in America, what lessons are there that would resonate with the type of things that Harris was raising?
Well, the first thing that I was going to say is that I'm relieved that Harris has reached all the same conclusions as I have in my history, and I think that it's I think this is absolutely right, and particularly I was struck by what you were saying about over-focus on the Middle East, because we've had a number of discussions with people from the State Department, and all they were talking about now is the Middle East, and this terrible phrase that they have, how can we move the needle in the Middle East? And, you know, I have two responses to that. You're not just moving the needle, and it's not just the Middle East. And one thing that's clear from the long perspective on American public diplomacy is that public diplomacy is not just one thing. Public diplomacy is made up of a number of constituent components. You've got advocacy, the thing that everybody pays most attention to. You've also got educational exchange and cultural work, and you've also got news work, the sort of thing that you were doing at Voice of America, Jeff. And each of those components has to be analyzed and judged in a different way. And sure, in advocacy, you can move the needle, but in education and cultural exchange, you only know decades later. Right. The way I like to think about it is taking a parallel, comparing public diplomacy to a Ministry of Agriculture. In a Ministry of Agriculture, you've got people who are responsible for dairy farming, people who are responsible for arable farming, and people who are responsible for forestry. You wouldn't dream of using the same criteria to analyze output in those three sectors. Nobody would ring up the person in charge of forests and say, well, how much forestry output do we have today? How much have your trees grown? But that's exactly the way in the circumstance in which people in education and cultural exchange are forced to operate. They have to justify themselves every year and prove themselves. They have to live in this crazy short-term world. And I find it incredibly frustrating as a historian to read the same arguments going on over and over again. And I can go back now to the debates immediately following the outbreak of the Cold War. And the same positions are being taken, the same problems are coming up, and I feel that nothing has been learned. And it is so frustrating to see the wasted opportunities, and to also see the same fantasies. One of the fantasies that I'm very aware of is the fantasy that public diplomacy, or as they called it back in, at the beginning of the Cold War, information, or as some people said, psychological warfare, that this is a magic transforming weapon that will solve all the problems. The magic bullet, or as I like to call it, Donald Rumsfeld's magic wand. That each generation you get somebody coming along who thinks that this can fix everything. If only we just mobilize our public diplomacy, we can sell the worst policy in the world, we can do anything with this. And people in the public relations industry know this isn't the case. How can it be that people in government can be so stupid, for want of a, I'm sorry, for want of a,
but I think what's
these high IQ morons is the only.
But what's happened is, a couple of years ago, there's a speech that you give in India in Bangalore. If you get, it's a major speech in the public relations industry. And Bangalore, to a certain extent, is the sort of founding sector of where communications took place in India. This was before it became the founding sector of all outsourced jobs from America. but at that time, it was a major marketing center. And I gave that speech right after 9/11. I gave it about 6 to 8 months later. And in giving their commencement speech that night, or their keynote speech that night, we got into a discussion. There was about 200-300 people there. It's fascinating. And several of you have been to India, and many of you probably, some of you come from India. But India is truly, in many respects, a multicultural country in much more than most Americans knew, much more than I knew when I got there. It's multicultural in both its religious backgrounds, but it's also multicultural in its sex, and it's also multicultural even when you see how people dress at the symposium, because some people dressed in formal garb that was not Western in nature. And when we got into a discussion of America, because this was post 9/11, the issues were why, in my mind, where is the issue? Where is the difficulty with America? And what was fascinating to me that night is, and I still believe this, and I think this goes to your issue, government talks about issues and positions that we take. There are winners and losers. There are people who are on our side or against our side. And that's the language that people in government use. Are they with us or are they against us? It's very simple. Okay? During the Cold War, it was a very easy equation. People look very differently. They talk about values. They talk about, do you understand us? Do you care for us as people? And then coming from America, my perspective is this is the most multicultural place in the world. When I come from America, I think of it as a place that celebrates religious pluralism. I think of this as a country that, I am an American. I believe in this country. I believe in its values. I believe that what we have always established is a place, as a beacon for other people to come to. What's fascinating is when you go around the world, they see that because they know that many of their brothers and sisters have immigrated to America. But when they see the positions America takes, that's when it breaks down. And that's the confusion that I think you're citing, which is people are separating America as a country, as a bastion of what it has always been, from its governmental policies. And we can't seem to bridge the gap.
This happened in the past around Vietnam.
Yes, it did.
And from the history of USIA, what's really interesting is that USIA comes back from Vietnam in two really interesting ways. One, they give really, really honest coverage of Watergate and open up to the world this fantastic spectacle of the American political system policing itself. And then 2 years later, 1976, they throw the most fantastic party to celebrate the bicentennial and invite everybody around the world in to take part in celebrating the founding values of this country, to talk about Thomas Jefferson, to talk about Abraham Lincoln, and the things that people are, rather than Nixon, rather than Johnson, to talk about the values that are the values on which this country was built. Yeah. And strategically, you saw USIA accepting that there were people who they would never reach, the generation of 1968, but saying, well, there's a whole, rather than being defeated by that, saying, well, there's a whole new generation of people out there who we can talk to, who we can engage with, a young generation who haven't made up their minds yet. And they worked incredibly well. And for me, the 1970s and the values that I see in USIA in the 70s offers hope that a lot of things could be turned around, could be an emphasis on dialogue, rather than, they even had a special training program for all American cultural affairs officers to understand, to teach them a doctrine other than American exceptionalism, the doctrine that the United States is an exceptional country and sort of knows best. And rather than have this sort of superior doctrine, they were taught that current scholarship for the 1970s was saying, well, America is just one of many experiences. The United States is not so exceptional and can be in discussion with the rest of the world about its problems. And my experience is that this country is never as attractive as when it's coming from behind and when it's honest about its problems. And you think about the heroes that you like in movies. The reason people like Rick in Casablanca is not because he's perfect and knows all the answers, it's because he's imperfect and is honest about his imperfections.
That's a British point of view. I can speak for the guys. Most of us like Rick because he got the girl. I wouldn't read too much into it.
He gives her away. He gives her away at the end.
That was what we didn't understand.
He gets the Frenchman.
I'm going to ask people to come. We have mics on both sides of the room, and I'm going to ask people to come to the sides and ask questions and get into the dialogue as well. Just to switch this for a minute, Harris, you talked about the news media. And you remember those old Fred Friendly seminars where people would be put in a particular situation, and the question would be, what would you do if you were in this situation? So suppose that you were working for 60 Minutes now, and you had a new series of pictures of Abu Ghraib. Mm-hmm. And we know that there are more pictures from Abu Ghraib. Obviously, Abu Ghraib, those pictures did tremendous damage to us in the world, but they were true, and they hopefully will have an impact in other ways. You're now executive producer of 60 Minutes. What do you do with them?
I think this is a very difficult issue, and I think every newsroom is actually struggling with it. I don't think the knee-jerk issue of publish is out there anymore. I think people do recognize that in a moment of wartime, there's a higher standard with respect to when do you publish and when don't you. I would argue that new pictures of Abu Ghraib probably don't contribute to the debate and would be less likely to necessarily get the attention nor be perceived as newsworthy as the past. I thought when they published the original pictures was the right thing to do. I think as many of us, we were horrified, and we take You know, you talk about the value of America. One of our greatest values is that we have had a free press that makes us confront ourselves. And I think that's probably sometimes its most important value, is it does make us confront who we are, or how people act on our behalf, or how people act and say they're acting on our behalf. So that's key. But I think you also have to recognize that those pictures today don't contribute. They don't add to the debate. They just continue the debate. And I'm not so sure that would necessarily
The Washington Post 2 weeks ago
Yes.
broke a story about the CIA.
Yep.
Did not mention in the story where the CIA was conducting alleged torturous actions, didn't mention the countries. Then the Financial Times actually listed those countries.
Right.
And the Independent.
And the Independent.
Right.
British press listed those countries. Was the Washington Post right to run that story?
I think the Washington Post was probably right to run the story. I also think the Washington Post was probably right not to necessarily list the countries. I'm not sure what that contributed. It's the same issue of whether or not you expose the name of an agent of the CIA. You know, I have relatively strong feelings that you don't do that type of thing. And so I feel, because I'm not sure it contributes to the debate. You know, one name doesn't mean anything, and I'm not sure where the locations were contributes to the debate. I think the fact that these camps exist are something that the American people has to know. And so there I'd agree. I would also point out that when I'm in Britain, a lot of their press will not do things that our press will name. I mean, each country has a tendency not to publish certain facts. And the British press, for instance, there's a thing called a D-notice, something that would be unconstitutional here. But when the British government decides that there are issues of national security and or issues involving even their criminal justice system, they have the ability to tell the press there not to publish.
It is illegal in Britain to print anything about a criminal case which is what we call sub judice. So if the criminal case is coming up to be before the court, you can't print the details here. Now, a lot of American papers would be much, much shorter if you had that rule in this country. It could be a major contribution to saving the forests.
I do want to invite people in the audience to get into this discussion. We certainly have a lot of people here who themselves are involved in this, both as public relations executives and also students who are thinking about the issue one way or another. Please. And maybe you could identify yourself to start.
Hi, I'm Drew Margolin. Just in actually what both of you were saying, it reminded me of when I was working in business and we were trying to develop new products for our customers, and we wanted to bring in people to do PR and talk about how do we get our loyal customers to take these new products. And as I recall, and maybe this is not correct or what the current theory is, but one of the biggest things that the PR firms talked to us about was, well, you have to really get to know your customers. You have to know why they like you. You have to know what it is they respect about your product. You have to listen to them and sort of adjust. You can't just say, well, because we're Medley, so therefore, our next thing, you will like it, and this sort of, with us or against us, please pledge your allegiance in advance, and then we'll tell you what to do next. And I was wondering if you guys could comment a little bit about how maybe the United States could do more to take a real look at, okay, people respect us, but why, and where are we consistent with that, and it seems to me that putting our best foot forward would involve not only listening in terms of opening dialogue, but really listening to the content of what people are saying. And if they're saying it's about AIDS in Africa, then that's the issue. If they're saying it's about Kyoto, then just listening more in that way. I don't know.
I mean, I think part of the problem we have, and I don't minimize this, it's also why I think it's long term, is the issues that you just raised are substantive. It's not that people don't understand America. I would actually say people understand us pretty damn well. I'm not talking about the terrorists, and I'm not talking about the nut jobs who are out there. But I'm talking about the general, larger universe of folks. They do, in fact, know us. And I think the issue is they disagree with us. Kyoto is a perfect example. People forget way before the invasion of Iraq. And, in the beginning of the Bush, his tenure, it was Kyoto that separated us from Europe. That was the single issue that more than anything else drove the polling numbers. And the truth of the matter is, whether Bush was president or, frankly, a Democrat was president, I'm a Democrat. But I would say that the issue of Kyoto, I doubt the United States would have ended up signing onto that treaty once Clinton was no longer president. So there are substantive issues that are actually separating us. I think the issue for us on a long-term basis is making sure that people understand why we take the positions we take, even when we can't agree with them. And that, unfortunately, I think this administration in particular has shortchanged.
One of the questions I think that Drew was raising, who's a graduate student here, by the way, but one of the implications is that we need to do much deeper research about these subjects. And do any of your clients do this kind of research that are relevant to them worldwide?
Absolutely.
Could you talk about what?
I mean, on the corporate side, I will tell you that most major American corporations that do work overseas, that we work with, keep a pretty good pulse with respect to understanding what is taking place with respect to both anti-Americanism, issues of their brand, issues of their image. I see some of my peers in the audience who run some of the public relations firms out here in California and globally, and I think we would all agree that corporations do have an understanding of it. And I would also tell you that the U.S. government, I mean, has a pretty good sense of the issue too. I think where it breaks down is the willingness to necessarily address the issues. I mean, that's, there is a real problem here.
And is Kyoto about global warming, or is it about America's sense of going alone, arrogance?
I think it's both. Yeah. I mean, from Europe, I suspect you feel that way sometimes.
And the same with the International Criminal Court. And
right.
I found that in my former life, lecturing on America, when I do alumni events, I have old ladies in the audience standing up and testifying about how much they disliked America because of American policy on the International Criminal Court.
Right.
And they see it as arrogant. They see it as undermining of international organizations, and the United States claiming to be something different and superior to all the rest of us. And it is resented by ordinary people in the streets. I'm not talking about people in elites, just the regular lady or gentleman on the bus.
If you were projecting today, if in fact the Congress passes legislation prohibiting torture and it's vetoed by the President of the United States, what's the impact of that on America's image of the world?
Oh, I think it'll be dramatic. I mean, I don't minimize it. If it ever gets to that point, the impact on the rest of the world will probably be to name us a global pariah. And I think it will take a long, long time for us to recover from an action like that.
Well, it's already the situation where the European Union can't deport prisoners here because for legal reasons, because the United States has the death penalty and has the largest, the largest prison population in the world?
Yes.
In absolute terms now? I think it's just
But we also
surpassed only by China.
But we have to be careful here, because in the end, a large part of the world sees international organizations as, and especially when you see the polling data, you do see this, sees the international organizations as a check on American power. And we also have to recognize that as Americans and for our government, that check is not necessarily something we want to do. And also that the record of international institutions for most Americans is appalling, the UN being a classic example. People see it as a failed organization rather than as a successful organization. So that there are legitimate issues here that are worthy of debate. Not everything America can do, nor would I argue should it do, is going to ever appease the rest of the world. The issue is, are we living up to our values? And if we're living up to our values, then are we communicating them well? Because I'm in the business of communication. I don't believe we communicate them well. I still have a problem when we are the largest country with the highest amount of church attendance, that a good part of the world thinks we are atheist. I have a problem that when we are a country who believes in so many of the family values that the rest of the world speaks to, that the rest of the world thinks that we don't have values. Our families generally have children. If you go to most of Western Union, they've given up on having children. There are real distinctions between our cultures right now, between our peoples. And I would be afraid that if America ever tried too much to join the rest of the world on certain issues, where frankly we're not going to. We're just going to disagree.
One thing that I think could be done, and I think there's a need for public diplomacy, but it isn't necessarily America talking to the world. I think facilitating the world talking to America would be a wonderful thing. And I'm so aware here that people in the American heartland not only don't understand the rest of the world, they don't understand their own country and the fragmentation within this country. Just the other week I was in a restaurant in Riverside, and they said, "Oh, you have an accent. You're from?" And I said, "Yes, I'm from England." And the people there said, "Oh, so waitress there said, so you must speak German then?" And I said, no, we speak English. And
yeah, but you're in California, and they just think Arnold, is European.
But that's all, But the sense of that one gets in the American interior, that people are well disposed to foreigners, but it's so far away. Why why bother about it? And I think that we can do things through internet technologies now make it possible to have real engagement between ordinary people in this country and ordinary people overseas. And where I feel optimistic is with the potential of ordinary people to transform each other. And
sorry. Oh, sorry. Just a little. But I mean, how do you feel? What do you think? Do you think it's good that American law firms have come in to take on these cases the way they have? You know, sort of just. I mean, do you think that sort of helps to repair the American?
I think it does.
Repair the damage that's been done by.
I think it absolutely does. I think it does. I think the fact that, you know, whether you agree or disagree with the Bush administration issue on the detainees, the reality is it's a public debate in the United States.
Yeah.
That wouldn't happen in many other nations. And I think people actually do understand that. You know, perhaps not people on the street, but I think among the elites, people do understand that debate is taking place, and I think it does reflect good on the United States. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
In fact, one of the things that we've been thinking is most important for American public diplomacy actually is displaying as widely as possible dissent and debate.
Yeah. One of the things that most impressed me as an observer of American public diplomacy was a single event that the embassy put on in my hometown of Leicester, where instead of bringing over one American politician, they brought two, one Democrat, one Republican, and had them debate each other in a room full of young people, many of whom were of Islamic British descent, and it was amazing to see how those people for the first time were able to connect with American politics so much more effectively than if they just had one person talking at them. Seeing it happen there, seeing what these two retired congressmen, seeing what they disagreed with and seeing what they agreed about and the culture that they shared was a very moving experience, and one that I'm always subsequently cranking back when people ask me what could America do. That's what I said.
I think so.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rita Tatil. I'm president of the Celebrity Source. I'm also co-chair of PRSA's National Professional Interest section on sports and entertainment. And the idea of harnessing Hollywood really intrigues me. So if you could ask Hollywood to do something to improve public diplomacy, what three things would you ask them to do? And
it's a great question.
And as because of my business, just as a second part to that, if you were to also envision celebrities as influencers as part of this goal, what would you envision that you would ask them to do?
You know, somebody said that to me earlier today when I was talking to them about what I was going to talk about tonight, and I was struggling for an answer then. And, you know, the honest answer is you do struggle for an answer because it's not simple. But I do think that at the end what Hollywood could do, and I think the Bush administration has actually reached out to Hollywood and has begun some of these discussions, but I think they're having the same issue of grappling with it, is Hollywood by definition, I mean, when you think of what our biggest export is, putting aside, you know, everything that we do in a physical manner, the biggest export is probably our culture. I mean, there's no place you go in the world today, maybe, you know, a few nations, but basically no place you go in the world today where it's not American movies and American music. They either love it or they hate it, but the reality is it's playing. And somehow we have to figure out with Hollywood, is that a vehicle by which the American message about a multicultural, multi-plural society can be better displayed and explained? Now, the problem with it is that Hollywood is in the moneymaker business. You know, Hollywood is not in the business of necessarily, you know, it's not the same as during World War II where they basically made propaganda movies and showed them to the home forces. They didn't export those movies overseas.
And creative types don't want to be told what to do.
Well, that's a separate issue. I mean, but that is an issue too, obviously. But creative types usually do like, you know, if there's a job to be done, generally there are people who are willing to do the job. But I think this is a difficult one. But clearly Hollywood has something magical to contribute to this debate. The issue is how to harness it. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we discussed it at a USC counselors meeting at the Annenberg estate, actually.
Well, maybe the word harness is the problem. Maybe stimulate.
Well, I think Hollywood needs to be sent. I mean, stimulate, they can do a lot. I mean, clearly when we make movies, you know, some of the issues are what are in the movies.
Could I come in on this? Because I think there are two things that immediately spring to mind. The first is that Hollywood needs to think about... Okay, I'll start in I'll start this way. There are a lot of people in the Middle East who could be converted, who are not the hard nuts. But if you look at Hollywood and the way in which Middle Eastern people and the Islamic religion have been portrayed by Hollywood, it is slanderous. It doesn't have to be that way. There was a film about 4 years ago now called Three Kings, starring George Clooney. That film brought on board an Islamic cultural advisor and an Arab cultural advisor. And those people had final cut on the film to make sure nothing went on the screen that wasn't acceptable to international audiences. And there have been other times in the American past when films were looked at for their cultural sensitivity, and when this was thought of as a priority. I think consciousness should be raised about the importance of not offending people around the world, and not taking a shortcut to make the villain an Arab so everybody knows where you are. To have a balance within the script. If you're going to have an Arab villain, have a sympathetic person there as well, a sympathetic Arab or a sympathetic Muslim, so that it isn't all one-sided. The other thing that if you look at the process by which movies are adapted from a European novel or a story is turned into a Hollywood version, it's given a simple ending. And when I think that Hollywood culture comes down to a simple solution, and often violence in a Hollywood film is the way in which the film reaches its dough note, reaches its conclusion. And I wish that Hollywood could have a more complex attitude towards violence. And you see there are some films which do this, but too often the great resolution of the film is not a debate or a question, but it has to reach a conclusion, and basically the hero has to fight the villain and win. And every film seems to come down to that final confrontation where boom. And I wish there was more complexity around that, because I think that you see the United States is misunderstood because of those sorts of stories. Violence doesn't solve everything.
We're going to have one last quick question and last quick answer is all we have time for, sir.
My name is Dennis Signorovich. The theme this evening has been the role of corporate America in improving America's image abroad. And I wonder if both the panelists would comment on whether they think that that very theme is inherently flawed, and that corporate America wants no part of improving the American image abroad. Google's been mentioned this evening. That other exemplar of American entrepreneurial spirit, Yahoo, just recently cooperated with the Chinese authorities to locate a dissident who was convicted and sent to a Chinese prison for 10 years because they were complying with Chinese law. I wonder if Yahoo is, I don't think they're much different from many other corporations, whether they simply want no part of the American image and are simply doing what they do best. Thank you.
I think corporations, by definition, are focused on building their business. I think that's what they're chartered to do, and in fact, I would argue that's what their responsibility is to their shareholders and owners. Having said that, I don't buy that premise. I think corporations that are headquartered in the United States are very worried about America's image. I think corporations in America are very worried about their ability to compete to a certain extent because of America's image, but it almost doesn't matter why they get there. I do think corporations are worried about it. I think the issue that you raised with respect to the internet is one that troubled me also. I think it troubles a lot of people. It's one that companies have to focus on, which is, the internet is changing things, and how do we cooperate or not cooperate with foreign governments with respect to the internet. But I do believe that American corporations are very concerned about their image, about America's image abroad, and what that means to them. And I think also when you look at most corporations, and especially for most of you who are students here, I will tell you that corporations today are more multicultural, multinational than in my working history. I mean, there's rarely a meeting I go to where there is not some discussion of something dealing with overseas markets and the need to be overseas. And so I would argue with the premise. I'm much more of an optimist on that issue. Now, how they participate in the discussion, that's a troublesome issue. That one I think we're still looking for that vehicle, and I think many of them are looking for that vehicle. You have a strong commerce secretary, and the truth of the matter is you did in the Clinton administration. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash. You probably knew Ron Brown. Ron Brown had an incredible relationship with many leaders in corporate America. And they were part of a lot of his trips overseas to open markets. He also was influential with the Clinton presidency. And so that was a vehicle by which corporations spoke. I'm not sure we have the exact same thing today, but the reality is I think corporations are focused on it. I wouldn't have as much of a concern about that.
One interesting thing that I've noticed as a historian is that there have been moments when corporations have tried to distance themselves from this country. I was amazed reading through minutes of a meeting held in the White House in 1946, the very beginning of the Cold War, where Truman was trying to get American corporations to fly the flag for anti-communism around the world, and the representative of Procter & Gamble said, excuse me, in England we are perceived as being an English company. We don't want to identify ourselves with America, thank you very much. We do very well as being perceived as an American company. USIA found this too in the early 90s when they went around rattling the tin cup to get some money to put up a World's Fair pavilion in Seville, I think, and companies were saying, no, we do not want to be identified with the United States. And I think today it's much harder to have that sort of, to have that sort of, to live in that sort of world.
We are inviting you all to dessert and coffee afterward. To Nick Cull, our first professor of public diplomacy, and to Harris Diamond for giving a stimulating lecture, which, as you said, this is a long-term problem. Hopefully you've taken us a step toward at least some sort of serious discussion resolution of it. Thank you so much for